Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be talking about positional and strategic ideas in chess and kind of how to define these things, how to define these terms, what they mean, and how we use them in our play. So if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button, click on that notification icon. So for starters, we have to define positional and strategic, and this is something that's really annoying because there's varying definitions for these things, and these are terms that get thrown around a lot by strong players all the time, and there's no real set definition of what they are. But for the most part, I would say that when people talk about strategic, what they're talking about is where do you attack in a position. Are you attacking the king side, queen side, or the center? So the first thing that we have to define is when we're talking about strategic play, what are we defining as the king side, what are we defining as the queen side, and what are we defining as the center? So for the most part, I think that strong players really separate it into three areas of the board. So this would be the king side, and notice that the king side includes the center. So this is really critical. We're including the center when we include our king side. And also, I believe this area would be defined as the queen side. And notice that we're including the center when we talk about the queen side. So we're including that whole center of the board, and we're including that queen side. And of course, when we just talk about the middle, and there are openings where we focus just on the middle and we don't focus on anything else, we're just talking about these 16 squares right there in the middle of the board, and we're not really talking about anything else. So when we're talking about the king side, we include that sweet center. We include these four squares and then the rest of the king side. Queen side, same thing. We include that sweet center that we're fighting for. Plus we're talking about the queen side. And then when we're talking about the middle, we're just talking about those 16 squares. So when we're talking about strategic chess, we're just saying, okay, which side of the board are we going to attack? And when we're talking about positional chess, we're talking about positional aspects of what's going on. So we're talking about double pawns, isolated pawns, weak squares, bishop pairs. We're talking about things like that. We're talking about long-term positional advantages that have nothing to do with an area of the board. They're not specific to an area of the board. So you could have a weak square anywhere on the board. You could have doubled pawns anywhere on the board. So you could have a bishop pair, and they could be on either side of the board. So what we're talking about is king side, queen side, center for strategic play, and we're talking positional play. It's going to be weak squares, weak pawns, etc. Okay, so there are openings and positions that are purely or seem purely strategic, and there are openings and positions that seem almost purely positional. But it's difficult to talk about these things in a vacuum because, of course, all the elements of chess affect one another when you play chess. You have to deal with strategic play, you have to deal with positional play, you have to deal with tactics, and the tactics are kind of the glue that bind all of this together, and it all tends to work together. But, okay, so here's an example of a fairly purely strategic opening. This is Robert James Fischer versus Bent Larsen. This game is typically called Slaying the Dragon, but the dragon variation in general, like e4, c5, knight of 3, d6, d4, cd4, knight d4, knight of 6, knight c3, g6, bishop e3, and then we have the Yugoslav variation, bishop g7, f3, castles, queen d2, knight c6, bishop c4, kind of began the Yugoslav attack in the dragon. So now the Yugoslav attack in the dragon is a classic example of almost a purely strategic position. Once both sides castle on opposite wings, so after a few more moves, like after we just very clearly define this. So we're going to have queen a5, castles, queen side. So now we have both sides of castled on opposite wings. White is castled over here on the queen side, and black is castled on the king side. So it's fairly well known at this point, both players are just going to be playing for mate. So we have a really purely strategic position. Now there is still a fight for the middle of the board that's actually really important. When I was a younger player, I kind of came up with my own strategic ideas, even though I didn't know that people had strategic ideas really since the time of Lasker, possibly even before. So I didn't realize that strong players had already separated this into three sections, king side, queen side, center, and I separated it into five, thinking I was being smarter. I separated it into king side, queen side, center, and then extreme king side, extreme queen side, thinking that in situations like this, it always seems like, white just ignores the middle of the board and just goes for the king side. But as I became a stronger player, I realized that the center is never ignored. So having an idea that you can just go extremely to the king side without paying any attention to the center at all is very faulty. Because when you start attacking this king side with like h4, h5, etc., and you're going after this king side to crack it open and bring everything in, more often than not, you have to complete that attack by getting rid of this knight, and more often than not, getting rid of that knight involves some maneuver in the middle of the board. So like the d5 square, for example, in the dragon is a super critical square, even while you're conducting your kingside attack, because controlling that d5 square for white will allow you to finish that attack. And it's the same thing for black. Black has to fight for this d5 square as well. If he has any hope of landing his queenside attack, he needs to control this d5 square as well. So both sides are still fighting for their section of the middle. So when you look at where is white's strategic attack right here, it's going to be here. So this is attacking the king side, so to speak. He's attacking this area of the board. This part is what he's trying to control. So he's definitely going to be moving over here with his pawns, like h4, h5, but he also needs to control his portion of the center. He doesn't care so much about this area over here. That's going to be black's area. Black is going to have more pieces, more control over there, and if he fights for that, he's just going to lose that battle. But this is what he's battling for, this area right here, and black is equally battling for this area. So black is battling for that queenside. So as you can see, there's some crossover here. Both black and white are going to be battling for that sweet center. They're both battling for those 4 squares pretty much at all times. So if you look at this game, Larsen continued attacking on the queen side, because that's his area of the board. And Fischer made one safety move with his king, which is pretty normal. And then he continues to battle for that central part of the board. Bishop d5, bishop d5, we have rook a c8, he retreats the bishop back to b3, making sure that the bishop controls d5 and isn't captured there. So then we had rook c7, h4, and he starts attacking that king side, h5, rook fc8, takes, and then we had g4, g5, and he sacrifices the exchange and finally breaks through on the king side. But notice that he's not making progress unless he controls that lane. So if it wasn't for his control over the d5 square and control of that diagonal, he's not making actual progress on the king side. So the king side involves a piece of the center at all times. So g6, and then we had e5 trying to fight back for that middle so he doesn't get rolled, but it's too late. And then we had takes, bishop h6, and eventually Fischer, and I'm just blitzing through this game just so you can see the strategic ideas. Eventually Fischer breaks through, but it also involves thrusts in the middle of the board. He eventually breaks through by bringing his queen through the center. So you see, he the whole time he was only fighting for squares within this section, but it's important to note that he did fight for squares right there in the middle of the board, and the middle can never be ignored. So he fought for that king side, fought for that queen side, fought for that center. So queen d6 check, and the game was over. It was going to be mate, and that was going to be the end of the game. Okay, so that was Fischer versus Larsen, played in 1958. That was a Slaying the Dragon game. So a lot of times, this kingside and queenside attack is not so clear. Like, let's take a look at this next game. This next game is Fischer versus Banco, which was played in 1963. And this game was a Pirc defense. So it starts out as a modern, turns into a Pirc. It's an Austrian attack. And then we have bishop d3. We have bishop to g4, h3, takes, knight c6, bishop e3, e5, takes, f5. So here, it's actually really clear that white is fighting for the king side because he's made this f5 thrust. His pawns are kind of pointing this direction, and it seems like a king side attack is kind of inevitable. It's not clear that white is going to also castle queen side and make it really logical for black to go after the queen side. What's also not clear is who has dominance in the middle of the board. Both people have a presence in the center of the board. White has a few more pieces there than black does, but both people have some sort of presence in the middle. So the middle is being really fought for in this position. A lot more in the other position. But white is also fighting for the king side. So we have those two strategic themes going on. And again, this is almost a purely strategic position, even though the center is relatively stable. It's just that black is fighting for equality, trying to equalize in the middle, whereas white is fighting for an advantage, fighting both for the center and for a king side attack. So we have gf5, queen f5, knight to d4, queen back to f2, and knight e8. And now white is going to continue assaulting on the king side. He's going to do so by castling king side. So he castles king side, and now it's just like basically once you castle king side in this position, you're definitely just playing for two results. White is either going to win on the king side, or black is going to find a way to equalize. But black doesn't really have a strategic section of the board to fight for, other than the center. He has to fight for the middle of the board because that's the only way he can equalize. And if black does equalize in the middle of the board, he'll be fine. But white does have strategic play. White has strategic play in the center and the king side. So that's why we can easily look at a position like this and just go, this has to be advantage white, because white's the one that's going to be playing for two results. He's going to be playing for mate, or he's going to be playing for dominance in the middle. And as it turns out, like Fischer went on to win this game very neatly. We have knight d6, queen g3, king h8, queen g4, c6. Queen h5, just going after that king. Queen e8, takes. Rook f6, which was kind of an Alekhine block maneuver, preventing pretty much anything. Like, for example, if bishop f6, e5 wins because there's mate on the h7 square. And this is all part of just attacking that king side. This is all part of going after that king side attack. But the game continued, king g8, just trying to come up with a move that didn't lose. But then, unfortunately, e5 is still a really good idea. h6, knight e2 just resigns. It's game over. There's not a move here that avoids white from finally breaking through with the king side attack without going into too many details. So, for example, like, I'll just give one line, just knight e2, and then we would have, rook d6 is the obvious threat. If bishop f6, bishop takes queen takes h6, and queen h7 mate is the threat, and it's not a stoppable threat. So that would be just one example of how this could end. Another example would be something like knight b5, queen f5 threatens the same thing, threatens queen h7 mate. Okay, so just going to go one more example here. We're going to take a look at the next game here. This is an example of when strategic and positional ideas kind of combine. So a game can start out purely strategic. So that's what happened in this game. This was Burns. This was Amos Burns versus Alexander Alekhine, and it started out as a French defense. A bunch of stuff got exchanged, and we have a purely strategic position. The French defense is a purely strategic position, which is you have these pawns that are locked in the middle of the board, and they're pointing this direction. So white's going to have a clear dominance over here on the king side. Black is also going to have a clear dominance over here on the queen side. Okay, so black is going to be fighting for that queen side. White's going to be fighting for the king side. The center pawns are locked, so even though we still include a piece of the center when we're attacking king side or queen side, in this case, the center's already kind of been decided. So there's nothing to really fight for in the middle of the board. So each side is going to be strategically playing for their side of the board. And that's what happened in this game. But positional elements always overlap, even when you're having sort of a purely strategic battle. One of the positional elements of the French is the French bishop. Long term, black is going to have this positional weakness of having a bad bishop. So if we have this strategic battle and nothing comes of it for either side, there's going to be this long-term problem of one person having a bad piece and one person not having a bad piece. And that's what happened in this game. So we have each side doing their strategic mission of kind of black is attacking the queen side, white's trying to hold off that attack while simultaneously he's trying to attack the king side. So each person has their side of the board. But what happens when Alekhine, tries to break through on the queen side and just a bunch of stuff gets traded? Just absolutely everything under the sun eventually gets traded. We have rook f2. White's just playing for exchanges. And he manages to exchange off everything. So now everything got exchanged off. So now the strategic battle has been decided. We had the strategic battle where white was attacking the king side. Black was attacking the queen side. Well, what came of that? Nothing. We all our pieces got exchanged, and now what's going on? Now it's going to be a purely positional battle. And that purely positional battle went very poorly in a few more moves when this bishop managed to get exchanged eventually for this knight. So we have a lot of maneuvering. We have a bad bishop. Alekhine's got the bad bishop. And we have more maneuvering. And then eventually we have bishop a4. So now the light-scored bishop, which is white's good bishop, gets exchanged for this knight on c6. And now we're left with one piece for each side. We're left with this bishop, which can do absolutely nothing. And we're left with this knight, which can do something. So we had this purely strategic battle of kingside versus queenside turn into a purely positional battle of good knight versus bad bishop, which white did eventually win this purely positional battle. He played around for a whole bunch of moves, but in the end, white's the only person that can attack things, and black has to defend, and black has a bishop that can never attack any of white's pawns. So positionally, black is lost in this position. Now, this is where you get positional strategic crossover in language as well. Some people might say strategically black is lost in this position, and that might be equally true, because when we talk about strategic chess, what we're talking about is plans. That's why when we talk about the king side, the queen side, the center, that's a strategy. We're talking about we have a king side attack strategy or a queen side attack strategy or a central attack strategy. So when people say strategic, a lot of times they're just talking about, generally they're talking about plans. So here we might say black is strategically lost because black has no plan. Black doesn't have a plan to attack any of white's pawns because it's impossible. But it's impossible because positionally his bishop is really bad. So when we're talking about positionally, we're talking about bad pieces, bad squares, etc. And when we talk about strategic chess, we're talking about plans. And so that's basically the definition of strategic and positional. That's kind of where the crossover is at. And those are the definitions that most people use when they're talking about strategic and positional. But again, this is really muddy territory. These words are thrown around a lot without anybody agreeing on any kind of universal definition. But for the most part, strategic means planning, and positional means things like weaknesses, weak squares, etc. Okay, so anyways, hope you found this video helpful. Hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.